In 1865, a president was shot in a theater. In 1963, another fell to an assassin's bullet. And in 2011, a dictator was dragged from a drainage pipe and killed in the desert. 3 different centuries, 3 different continents, 3 men who seemingly had nothing in common, except for one terrifying pattern that connects them all. Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Muammar Gaddafi. Each ruled during moments of profound crisis when power concentrated in their hands. Each made decisions about money that threatened the established financial order. And each paid the ultimate price. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't what they did that made them targets. It was what they challenged. Because throughout history, leaders can survive enemies, wars, even revolutions. But when they threaten the monetary system itself, when they try to create money outside the control of the banking establishment, they enter the most dangerous territory a leader can occupy. This is the story you weren't taught in school. This is what happened when 3 powerful men dared to touch the one thing elites protect above all else: control over money itself. If you find these hidden connections between money and power fascinating, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel uncovers the economic events that shaped our world while everyone was sleeping. The real forces that move history from behind the scenes. Chapter 1. When 3 leaders said no to banks. Let's start in 1861 when the United States was tearing itself apart. The Civil War had just begun, and President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible problem. The Union needed massive amounts of money to fight, approximately $2 to $3 million per day. That's the equivalent of over $60 million daily in today's dollars. Lincoln turned to the banks of New York and Philadelphia for loans. These financial powerhouses offered to lend the government the money it desperately needed, but there was a catch, and it was devastating. The banks demanded interest rates between 24% and 36%. Think about that for a moment. The nation was bleeding, families were being destroyed, and financial institutions saw an opportunity to profit enormously from the country's suffering. Lincoln was furious. In his view, the government shouldn't have to pay private banks massive interest to defend itself. So in 1862, he did something radical. He convinced Congress to pass the Legal Tender Act, which authorized the Treasury to print $150 million in government-issued currency. These bills, printed with green ink on the back, became known as Greenbacks. Eventually, the amount increased to $450 million, funding about 15% of the Union's war costs. Here's what made this revolutionary. These greenbacks weren't backed by gold or silver. They were backed only by the credit and promise of the United States government. And critically, they were issued without any debt to private banks. No interest, no bondage to financial institutions. The government simply created the money it needed. Fast forward exactly 100 years to 1963. President John F. Kennedy was dealing with a different monetary crisis. Silver prices were rising dramatically, approaching and sometimes exceeding the face value of silver certificates and coins. The Treasury was hemorrhaging its silver reserves as people hoarded coins for their metal content rather than their currency value. On June 4, 1963, Kennedy signed Executive Order 1110. This order delegated to the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to issue silver certificates, a power previously held by the President. Alongside this, Kennedy supported congressional legislation to phase out silver-backed currency entirely in favor of Federal Reserve notes. The order allowed the Treasury to issue up to $4 billion in silver certificates during the transition period. Now jump ahead to 2009. Muammar Gaddafi, who had ruled Libya for 40 years, was pushing an ambitious vision across Africa. He proposed the creation of a gold-backed African currency called the gold dinar. Libya possessed 144 tons of gold reserves, one of the largest holdings on the continent. Gaddafi wanted African and Middle Eastern countries to trade oil and other resources using this gold-based currency, instead of US dollars or European euros. His plan would have created a unified African monetary system, independent of Western financial control. It would challenge the CFA franc, a currency controlled by France and used by 14 African nations. More importantly, it would threaten the dollar's dominance in global oil markets. 3 leaders, 3 moments of financial innovation, and all 3 were about to discover a terrible truth about power. Chapter 2. Why banking power never surrenders. Lincoln's Greenbacks created immediate tension with the banking establishment. The money worked, it circulated, it funded the war effort, and it didn't require the government to spiral into crushing debt to private financiers. But financial interests were watching nervously. A precedent was being set. Governments could create their own money supply without borrowing from private banks. Contemporary newspaper accounts reveal the anxiety this caused in financial circles. The London Times published an editorial stating, "If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized governments of the world." The editorial continued with a warning. This would be dangerous to banking interests. The power to create money without debt to private banks threatened the entire structure of financial control. As Lincoln's presidency continued, he faced increasing pressure from multiple directions. Yes, the war was the obvious crisis, but beneath it ran deeper currents of financial power struggling for control. Kennedy's Executive Order 11110 has been wildly misunderstood. Many conspiracy theorists claim it was an attack on the Federal Reserve. Actually, it was the opposite. The order was part of Kennedy's plan to strengthen Federal Reserve notes by eliminating silver certificates. The Treasury Department under Kennedy was actively working to modernize the monetary system, moving away from precious metal backing toward a purely fiat currency controlled by the Federal Reserve. But here's what made some people nervous. The order technically gave the Treasury Department the power to issue currency outside the Federal Reserve system during the transition period. While Kennedy's intention was to phase this out, the legal framework existed for Treasury-issued money. Some saw this as a crack in the Federal Reserve's monopoly, a potential pathway that could be exploited later. Meanwhile, Kennedy was making other enemies. His handling of the Bay of Pigs, his negotiations during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his civil rights positions, all created powerful opposition. The monetary issue was just one thread in a complex web of conflicts. Gaddafi's gold dinar proposal escalated throughout 2009 and 2010. He wasn't just talking, he was actively building support. The African Union, which Gaddafi chaired, discussed the proposal seriously. Several African nations expressed interest. Most concerning to Western powers, Gaddafi was demanding that European countries pay for Libyan oil in gold dinars rather than euros or dollars. Libya at this time was producing about 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. If that oil suddenly required gold-backed African currency for purchase, it would set a precedent that could ripple across the continent. Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, major oil producers might follow suit. The implications for dollar dominance were staggering. By early 2011, tensions were reaching a breaking point. The Arab Spring had begun sweeping across North Africa. In Libya, protests against Gaddafi's government started in February. And then, everything accelerated. Chapter 3. The assassinations that changed everything. April 14, 1865. Good Friday. President Lincoln attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes. Booth entered Lincoln's box and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln died the next morning. Booth's motivations were documented in his own writings. He was a passionate supporter of slavery and the Confederate cause. He believed Lincoln was a tyrant who was destroying the constitutional republic. There's no credible historical evidence that bankers hired Booth or orchestrated the assassination. His motivation was political and racial ideology. He wanted to revive the Confederate cause by eliminating its primary enemy. But here's what happened after Lincoln's death. The Greenbacks were systematically removed from circulation. The national banking system was strengthened. Government borrowing from private banks resumed and expanded. Whether or not banking interest caused Lincoln's assassination, they certainly benefited from it. November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was riding in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza when shots rang out. Lee Harvey Oswald, firing from the Texas School Book Depository, killed the president. 2 days later, Oswald himself was murdered by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. The Warren Commission concluded Oswald acted alone, motivated by Marxist ideology and personal psychological issues. Decades of investigation have found no credible evidence connecting Kennedy's assassination to Federal Reserve policy, banking interests, or Executive Order 1110. The monetary order explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Kennedy was actually strengthening the Federal Reserve System, not weakening it. But again, what happened after his death? Executive Order 1110 remained on the books but was never used to issue Treasury notes. Silver certificates were phased out completely. The Federal Reserve's control over the money supply became total and unquestioned. Regardless of why Kennedy died, the banking establishment emerged more powerful than before. February 17, 2011, protests erupted in Benghazi, Libya, inspired by the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. Gaddafi's security forces responded with violence. By March, Libya had descended into full civil war. The international community watched nervously as refugees flooded into Europe and reports of massacres emerged. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, establishing a no-fly zone and authorizing member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians. 2 days later, NATO forces began bombing Libyan government positions. Released State Department emails later revealed French intelligence assessment that Gaddafi's gold reserves and plans for a gold-backed currency were factors in French President Sarkozy's decision to push for intervention. While humanitarian concerns were genuine, Gaddafi was threatening to massacre civilians in Benghazi. Economic and monetary interests were also clearly in play. By October 2011, rebel forces had captured most of Libya. On October 20th, Gaddafi was found hiding in a drainage pipe near Sirte. He was captured, brutally beaten, and killed. Video footage of his final moments shocked the world. Chapter 4. Who really won when they died? After Lincoln's assassination, the American monetary system underwent rapid transformation. The Greenback currency that had functioned successfully during the war came under immediate attack. Financial interests pushed for a return to the gold standard and the elimination of government-issued currency. The Coinage Act of 1873, known by critics as the Crime of 73, demonetized silver and effectively put the United States on a gold standard. This created a massive deflationary pressure because gold was scarce and controlled primarily by banking interests and wealthy individuals. Farmers and workers found themselves crushed by debt that became increasingly difficult to repay as money became scarcer and more valuable. The debate over monetary control, whether government or private banks should create money, would dominate American politics for the next 50 years. It wasn't until 1913, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, that the issue was somewhat settled. But note how it was settled, with a private banking consortium given control over the nation's money supply. After Kennedy's assassination, Executive Order 1110 faded into obscurity. The last silver certificates were printed in the 1960s. By 1968, silver was completely removed from US coins. The transition to a purely fiat currency, controlled entirely by the Federal Reserve, was complete. In 1971, President Nixon would close the gold window entirely, ending even the international convertibility of dollars to gold. From that moment forward, the US dollar, and through it, the global financial system, was backed by nothing except faith in the government and, more fundamentally, faith in the Federal Reserve's management of the monetary system. The power of the Federal Reserve and the global banking system became essentially unquestioned. Anyone who raised concerns about this arrangement was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. The monetary order established in the aftermath of Kennedy's death has persisted, essentially unchanged to this day. After Gaddafi's fall, Libya descended into chaos. The gold reserves, 144 tons, valued at over $6 billion, disappeared. Some was likely seized by various militia groups. Some may have been smuggled out of the country. To this day, the full accounting of Libya's gold remains unclear. The gold dinar plan died with Gaddafi. No African nation pursued it afterward. The CFA franc continued operating. Oil sales continued in dollars and euros. The monetary structure of global trade remained unchanged. Libya itself became a failed state. Multiple governments claimed legitimacy. Militia groups controlled different territories. The country that once had the highest GDP per capita in Africa became a humanitarian disaster zone. By 2025, Libya still struggles with instability, civil conflict, and competing power centers. European nations that led the intervention quickly discovered that removing Gaddafi was far easier than building anything functional to replace him. The refugee crisis intensified. ISIS found safe haven in ungoverned spaces. The Western intervention, whatever its initial motivations, created consequences that would echo for decades. Chapter 5. What historians won't tell you. Looking back across these three cases, historians and economists have drawn different conclusions about what actually happened and why. For Lincoln, the mainstream historical consensus is clear. John Wilkes Booth assassinated him because of slavery, Confederate sympathy, and white supremacist ideology. Booth's own writings confirm this. The banking conspiracy theory emerged decades later, promoted by fringe economists and conspiracy theorists, but it has no support from serious Lincoln scholars. However, it's also true that banking interests were threatened by greenbacks and benefited from their elimination. Can two things be true simultaneously? Can Booth have acted from racist ideology, while also inadvertently serving financial interests that wanted Lincoln gone? History is rarely simple. For Kennedy, the monetary conspiracy theory is even weaker. Every credible investigation has concluded that Executive Order 111-110 strengthened the Federal Reserve rather than threatening it. The order was actually removing a competing form of currency, silver certificates, to give Federal Reserve notes total monopoly. Banking interests had no reason to oppose this. The Kennedy assassination spawned countless conspiracy theories, involving the CIA, the Mafia, Castro, the Soviets, precisely because so many people couldn't accept that a lone gunman with psychological problems could kill a president. The monetary theory is just one of dozens of explanations people have grasped for, seeking a grand conspiracy that makes sense of senseless violence. Yet once again, regardless of cause, the effect was to cement the Federal Reserve's total control over money creation. The outcome served banking interests, even if they didn't cause it. Gaddafi's case is more complex. The NATO intervention was definitely driven by multiple factors. Genuine humanitarian concerns as Gaddafi threatened civilians, European interest in Libyan oil contracts, French domestic political considerations, and yes, concerns about monetary disruption. Released State Department emails show that French intelligence specifically mentioned Gaddafi's gold reserves and his plans for a gold-backed currency as threats to French influence in Africa. So the monetary dimension was real and documented, not a conspiracy theory, but an actual factor in decision making. But was it the primary cause? Probably not. The primary cause was Gaddafi's brutal response to the Arab Spring protests and the refugee crisis threatening Europe. The monetary issue was one factor among many, a contributing cause but not the sole explanation. What's fascinating is the pattern across all three cases. Whether the monetary factor caused their deaths or merely coincided with them, the result was always the same. Existing power structures emerged stronger. Alternative monetary systems were eliminated. Established banking interests consolidated control. This raises a profound question that goes beyond conspiracy theories. In moments of crisis and transition, who actually benefits? When leaders fall, which institutions rise? And if we see a pattern repeating across history, where challenges to monetary orthodoxy seem to precede catastrophic consequences for those who make the challenges, shouldn't we at least ask why? The truth might not be a conspiracy. It might be something more subtle, a system that defends itself through mechanisms more complex than hired assassins, through structural pressures we barely understand. Chapter 6. Why this matters to your wallet today. So what do these three stories teach us about power, money, and the world we live in today? First, understand that money is not neutral. It's not just a tool for buying groceries or paying rent. Money is power in its most concentrated form. Control over who creates money, how much exists, and who gets access to it first. These are questions that determine the shape of entire civilizations. Second, recognize that systems are self-defending. You don't need a smoking gun or a secret conspiracy for powerful structures to protect themselves. Markets punish countries that challenge monetary orthodoxy. Investors flee. Credit dries up. International institutions impose conditions. Media narratives shift. The system has 1,000 ways to defend itself without anyone needing to order an assassination. Sometimes violence does occur, but perhaps not because shadowy bankers ordered it. Rather, because challenging fundamental power structures creates instability, attracts opposition from multiple directions, and increases vulnerability. It's less conspiracy than ecosystem. Predators are drawn to wounded prey. Third, learn to think critically about cause and effect. Just because two things happen near each other in time doesn't mean one caused the other. Lincoln implemented Greenbacks and later he was assassinated, but Booth's motivation was slavery and Confederate ideology. The two events are connected by timing, not causation, but also recognize that outcomes matter as much as intentions. Even if banking interests didn't cause these deaths, they benefited from them. That pattern deserves examination even without conspiracy. If stories like this, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, fascinate you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel because we're just getting started with these financial, educational mysteries.